Okay, I think we're good to go now. Thank you so much, everyone, for bearing with us. Thank you also, Rabbi Zuckier, of course, and welcome to the final class in this series on, what Torah is. Since the last one, I'm looking forward to kind of pushing those outer limits, and I'll hand it over to you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. And yeah, we will pick up where we left off last time. We were working through the sugya in Brachos Yud Aleph, which talks about the question of Birchas HaTorah and what sort of texts one says the bracha on the Torah, and that can be seen as, we saw there are different possibilities, but that could be seen as a proxy for the question of what is actually defined as Torah. So we'll pick up with that, and we'll start by quickly reviewing the relevant part of the Gemara. So the screen should be shared. And yeah, so starting from Amar Rav Huna, question is on what sorts of items that are studied does one need to say a bracha? Amar Rav Huna lemikra tzarech levarich, lemedrash eno tzarech levarich. One says a Birchas HaTorah, blessing before studying Torah for mikra, for Tanakh, biblical study, but not for medrash, not for the creative readings and textual analysis of the rabbis. For medrash, you don't need to. Rabbi Lazar disagrees. Rabbi Lazar Amar lemikra ula medrash tzarech levarich. You need to say a bracha both on Tanakh and on medrash. The Mishnah ain't tzarech levarich, but for Mishnah, which of course is not ordered around the psukim, but is sort of an independent, independently organized set of teachings, mostly about what one should do, you don't need to say a bracha. We said probably those first two views understand that either only Tanakh counts as Torah in this sense, or only Tanakh and direct commentaries and expositions of it, but not Mishnah. But then Rabbi Yochanan disagrees. Rabbi Yochanan Amar af Mishnah tzarech nami tzarech levarich. You also need to say a Birchas HaTorah on Mishnah, but not for Talmud implicitly. The Rava Amar af Talmud tzarech levarich. Rava says even for Talmud, the explication of the Mishnah, one needs to say a bracha. And again, this view seems to say that these two views seem to say that Mishnah and maybe also Talmud count as Torah. Again, last time we saw a variety of readings that may or may not tie this into, may or may not detach this from our question. It might be about other issues, maybe about whether there's an action or not in the study, as opposed to whether it counts as a core item of Torah. We're going to leave those aside for now, that we did last time, and we'll look now at some in terms of psak, in terms of how this is decided in the classical code. So sources 3 and 4, which we quickly saw last time, we'll jump into this now. The Tur in the 14th century, sort of the setting the stage for the central code of Jewish law, says B'tzarech levarech lemikra lemedrash ulemishnah uletalmud. All four categories, the final view that all four of them you need to say a bracha: mikra, biblical study; medrash, the midrashic analysis; mishnah, the freestanding codes; and Talmud, the explication of that. All four of them you say a bracha like the final view, right? And of course the Gemara itself there, right? It was only for A but not B, for A and B not C, A, B, and C but not D, and for all of the above. And we follow the final view, all of the above. The Shulchan Aruch, interestingly enough, usually he agrees with the Tur. Here, he very interestingly leaves out a word. He says, Tzarech levarech bein lemikra, bein lemishnah, bein legemara, leaving out medrash, leaving out category number 2, at least in the Gemara text that we have. We saw last time some people actually put medrash at the end. So maybe it's possible, none of the commentaries in the Shulchan Aruch say this, but it's possible to read the Shulchan Aruch as saying that he actually rejects that the final view. He rejects the view that includes medrash, and only the other 3, only Mikra, Mishnah, and Gemara would be included. What might be the logic for that? Arguably, one might say that Mikra, Tanakh, that's sort of part of the central canon. Mishnah, the core laws, and Gemara, the explication of them, those are all very important for determining the law in terms of its practice. Whereas Medrash is not as central, it's not as canonical in a sense. I think if you'd ask, you'd ask someone, what are the 3 most important classical Jewish works? They might very well say Mikra, Mishnah, and Gemara, right? The Bible, Mishnah, and the Talmud, or maybe both Talmuds. Those are the 3 classical texts. Medrash, Medrash, including Medrash halacha, very important, but arguably you could say it's less central. It doesn't determine the halacha. It's not a biblical book itself. So even though it's a commentary in the biblical book, even though it ties in to the central texts that decide the halacha. So in some sense, the bridge between Tanakh and Mishnah or Talmud is Medrash halacha at least. Still, you might say that's not good enough. That's not enough to qualify for saying a Birchas Torah. That's not how the Shulchan Aruch is understood. Everyone understands the Shulchan Aruch as saying, okay, he left out the word Medrash because it's implied by something else. It's implied by Gemara. It's implied by Mikra. But of course, the Shulchan Aruch agrees with the Torah. That's the standard interpretation. I'm just pointing out that that's not necessarily obvious. In the Shulchan Aruch work itself, the Aggadah, the comment of the Ramah that's thrown in says Bein LeMedrash. He explicitly says Medrash as well, and the addition throws in Torah. It's based on the Torah, but the Shulchan Aruch himself doesn't say that. Again, not that. I think in practice, if it's time to say Birchas, it's time to say Birchas HaTorah, and you haven't said Birchas HaTorah yet, and you're about to study Medrash. I think everyone would say in practice you should say Birchas HaTorah, but at least in theory, the Shulchan Aruch may have a dissenting view on that point. All right, so let's look at some other commentaries here and try to understand what the logic is, what the basis is of these views, and see how far we can extend the boundaries of Torah. I think that's the title of this, right? What are the outer bounds of Torah? The sort of core four, to use a gymnastics reference, appears in the Gemara, right? That's Mikra, Medrash, Mishnah, and Gemara. But maybe there's something beyond the core four. Maybe we can extend further than that. And that'll be our question. I see Ozzy posted a question in the chat. Why not leave out Medrash Aggadah? So we're going to talk about Medrash Aggadah. Certainly, if you exclude Medrash Halacha, the earlier, more halachically based Midrashim, you'd certainly leave out Medrash Aggadah, but you might leave out both. That's at least also a possibility, and you might include both. So let's keep going. The Lavush here, commentary on Shulchan Aruch says, "V'chayiv levarich bein Mikra, bein Mishnah, bein Talmud, bein Medrash." He quotes really the Torah, and says, what's his reasoning? The Kulu Torah Mikri, they all count as Torah. That's the straightforward reading, right? The straightforward understanding. The reason you say Birchas Torah is because they are Torah, and that as we said last time, that's what connects this sugya, this Gemara's discussion, to our larger topic of what counts as Torah. The Pri Chadash here, another commentary, says Haggah Bein LeMedrash, right? He's commenting on the Ramah, who throws in that Medrash is also included, even though it wasn't explicitly said by the Shulchan Aruch. And he notes Haposkim lo kasvu Medrash to be kol shekain the Gemara nafik. It's a kol shekain. It's a kal v'chomer. If you include Gemara, you definitely should include Medrash. It's clear because as you saw in the Gemara, as we read it, you start with Tanakh, then Medrash, and then Mishnah, then Gemara. If you have Gemara is the least obvious of the four, at least in the text of the Gemara we have. If you're going to include Gemara, you should certainly include Medrash. Now, on that basis, the Shulchan Aruch could have only said Gemara, and he could have left out the other three. Okay, that's a fair question. So it's a bit of it's not the strongest answer, but it's a possible answer. But if you say Gemara, you certainly would include Medrash. That's his reading of the Shulchan Aruch. Inami, alternatively, B'chal Mikra Havi. Maybe it's based on Mikra. Tanakh, it includes commentaries on Tanakh, such as Medrash. Now, there'd be an interesting implication of this. Presumably, if Tanakh includes commentaries on Tanakh, so that would include not just Medrash, but also other commentaries. Let's say classical medieval commentaries, the Mefarshim on Tanakh, Rashi, Radak, Abarbanel, you name it. Maybe even some modern, more contemporary commentaries, Malbim. Wherever one might draw the line, but you could very easily say, if it's a commentary on Tanakh, that counts as Torah. So even though you're not necessarily reading a pasuk, you still would have to say a Birchas Torah before you go through one of those Malbim rabbit holes. V'chein mashma b'Gemara, that's implied by the Gemara that Tanakh, that Medrash is part of Tanakh. Okay, and then he says the Mari Kash says Kasav shebechlal Talmudhu. No, it's not included in Mikra. It's included in Talmud. Medrash is not part of Torah Shebichsav. It's not part of the written Torah. The written Torah is Tanakh. Medrash is part of Torah Shebal Peh. It's part of the oral Torah. These are traditions that are passed down as about how to interpret Tanakh. Medrash kit Talmud. There we say Medrash is like Talmud. So maybe that means Medrash is a species, is a subset of Talmud. Aval HaTorah is Kiro. But so we have three different reasons, three different suggestions from the Pri Chadash as to why the Shulchan Aruch left out the word Talmud. left out the word medrash, but it's still included, right? It could be he left it out, no clear reason, but it's a kal v'chomer. If Gemara is included, then certainly medrash. That's one possibility. The other possibility is it's included in Mikra. Part of Bible is commentaries on Bible, and that would have an interesting implication for all other commentaries on Tanakh. And then the third answer is that it's a form of Talmud, which would mean when we say Talmud, we don't just mean Talmud like the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud Yerushalmi. When we say Talmud, maybe we mean all of Torah Shebaal Peh, right? And if you include Medrash as part of Talmud, we've opened the Pandora's box. You can include a lot of other things in Torah Shebaal Peh, and it could really go pretty far. We're gonna test some of these cases. We're not gonna be able to talk about every scenario, but you can really keep extending it if that's what you wanted to do. Okay, for the Birkei Yosef, let's see. One moment. Yeah. So the Birkei Yosef, another commentary. He has a few different comments here, but we'll focus on one of them. And he raises our question. He raises a question we talked about last time about the Gemara's proof for saying that you would say a bracha on Gemara is a story about how Rav would say a bracha before learning a medrash, and it didn't really line up. You said a bracha on medrash, therefore you should say a bracha on Gemara. The two are not the same thing, so that's a little weird. So then he wants to explain that. He says, "Ivrab de b'shas lo kasha." Okay, and now he's going to introduce an important distinction. Mishum de matzina lemeimar yesh lechalik bein medrash lemedrash. And Ozzy, this will get back to your point. We can distinguish between different types of midrash, different types of rabbinic commentaries on Tanakh. The medrash to Nikiti Amorai, Hainu medrash Aggadah. The medrash in the Gemara that Rav was learning, and then he said a Birchas Torah on, that's medrash Aggadah. That's Aggadic midrash. That's midrash that's both at a later period in time, from the period of the Amoraim rather than Tanaim, and primarily deals with narrative issues rather than legal issues. The Darish the Krai Derech Drash V'Aggadah Shel Yofi. Medrash Aggadah, its style is to have these nice, cute interpretations of the verses. Yofi, right? It's aesthetically pleasing, but it's not necessarily legally rigorous. And that's as opposed to Medrash Halacha, which is more legally rigorous. Medrash Zeh L'Manda Amar Havi Kimikra. And there's an argument to say that this Medrash that's sort of aesthetically interpreting the biblical text, that's like Mikra. It's an extrapolation, it's an extension of the biblical stories, right? So if you, right, the Psukim talk about Avram leaving Haran and going away from there, and the Medrash tells us the story about how he destroyed his father's idols. So that would be a Medrash Aggadah, and maybe that's sort of an extension of Mikra. That's an extension of Tanakh study, because it's not, it's definitely not legal in nature, but it's, it's an extension of the story. So maybe it's just like Mikra. Aval Braisos the Sifra v'Sifrei, but what's known as Medrash Halacha from the Tannaitic period, the earlier period, 3rd century, let's say, and focusing on legal issues, the Hein Gufei Torah, these are central parts of Torah, the Kulei Alma Dinam Kikmara. Obviously, Medrash Halacha qualifies as Gemara, because it's basically the same thing. I mean, the Gemara all the time quotes Medrash Halacha. Right, the Gemara will quote something. It won't specify where it's from. It'll sound like it's some brisa somewhere. And if you look, you poke around, you'll find it in the Medrash Halacha, because Medrash Halacha is legal exposition of the Torah. And then the Gemara, also doing legal exposition of the Torah, draws on the earlier Medrash Halacha. So that's a central part of Torah Shebaal Peh, and that's obviously going to count as Gemara. The Asi Shapir Hadar Rava, and then it works out in the Gemara Rava's point, where Rava says, you also say a Birchas Torah on Medrash. How do I know this? Because you also say a Birchas Torah on Gemara. How do I know this? Because Rav would always say a Birchas Torah on Medrash. The Medrash he's talking about there is Medrash Halacha, and Medrash Halacha is basically the same as Gemara, because both of them deal with legal issues, explicating Psukim to do that. That's one type of Medrash. Aval Rashi Kasav, Medrash Hu Karav L'Mikra. Remember last time we saw that Rashi remember we first had Mikra, then we had Medrash. Rashi says, why would you include Medrash? Because Medrash, it's Karav L'Mikra, it's close to the biblical text, it's an extension. Can go Mechilta v'Sifra v'Sifrei Lefizeh Kasha. Now Rashi doesn't work with this approach we just said. This approach we just said would explain that the things that are close to the biblical text, that would be Medrash Aggadah, the stories. the things that are close to Gemara is Medrash Halacha, the legal materials. Rashi, though, specifies Medrash Halacha, the legal midrashim, and says those are close to the biblical text. So this wouldn't work. This approach wouldn't work according to Rashi. Then he says, "Well, MS Denirim Divrei Rashi." No, we can explain it like this: the Amrit de Barich Medrash Haggadah de Darish Lekrai Lami Yigas Sifra v'Sifrei de Bishagam Heim Dinim Havi Perusha Lekrai Utfemis Naber Levarich Sifra v'Sifrei de Tarti Isnubu Mishpatim Yisharim U Perusha Lekrai. Here's how you have to understand Rashi. Definitely, Medrash Aggadah is Tanakh. Medrash Aggadah is an extension of Tanakh. What about Medrash Halacha? So until now, we've been saying Medrash Halacha is, since it's legal issues, it's like Gemara. And so that's true, but it's also Tanakh. Basically, he's saying Medrash Halacha, because it both interprets the biblical text and has important legal issues, sort of qualifies for two reasons. It's overdetermined that Medrash Halacha is part of Torah because it's both part of Mikra, part of an extended definition of Bible, of Tanakh, and it's part of Gemara because it's part of Torah Shebal Peh. It's Gufei Torah. That's his explanation in the end. So that's why Rashi says Medrash Halacha is part of Tanakh. But the proof later in the Gemara seems to imply that Medrash Halacha is Gemara because it's actually both. It gets in for two different reasons. It's doubly qualified as Talmud Torah. So that's a very interesting piece here by the Birkei Yosef. And we'll now jump up. We skipped a source because I think it fits better to just read this now. The Aruch HaShulchan. It was a bit later, 19th century, a very important posek. Just an ad about the Aruch HaShulchan. Most commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, sort of, or on the Torah, sort of start with the Torah or the Shulchan Aruch as their text. They start with that text and they'll quote a word, a lemma, a dibra maschil, and they'll discuss it. And they may go back to the Gemara a little bit here and there and quibble about certain issues. They may deal with the text of the Shulchan Aruch, but essentially they're commentaries. The Aruch HaShulchan, he's not the only one to do this, but pretty unique, especially in as late a time as the 19th century. He says no, he wants to reorganize the sugya on his own, and that's why in the Aruch HaShulchan he's organized around the Shulchan Aruch in the sense that he has simanim. It's organized in the same way. The same 4 books of Shulchan Aruch and the simanim are the same, and the basic order is the same. But he reorganizes. Instead of starting with the Shulchan Aruch as his base text, he wrote a freestanding composition of his own, going back to the Gemara, explicating it much more. The Shulchan Aruch generally doesn't spend time explicating the Gemara. He does that in the Beis Yosef, in his commentary on the Torah, but in his legal code, he doesn't do that. The Aruch HaShulchan is a mix of code and discussion of sources. And because he's, as late as the 19th century, he can incorporate into his organizational structure even sources that were relatively recent. So let's look at the Aruch HaShulchan here, after that little infomercial for the Aruch HaShulchan. And also he was a community rabbi, so he was very attuned to practical matters, which is very important for a posek. Many poskim are, work more in theory, and there are some upsides to that, but also some drawbacks. So fine, he writes, Tzarech levarich bein lemikra, bein lemishnah, bein legemara, bein lemedrash. So note, he throws in medrash, like the Torah, not like the language of the Shulchan Aruch. And what is medrash? V'hainu midrash hamikros b'mechilta v'sifra v'sifra. He quotes Rashi that medrash here means medrash halacha, the explication, the legal explication of the Torah. Vidah sheyesh le'estapek v'lomei divrei Aggadah ki medrash rabbah. And he says, you know what? What about medrash Aggadah? What about the sort of stories about the Torah and in other biblical books, the stories that sort of build on it more? Not sure. Lehistapek. He's not certain whether you say a Berachas Torah on that. Right. So let's say if you want to read the little Medrash says, or the adult Medrash says, or I think it's just known as the Medrash says. So there's a lot of Medrash Haggadah. There are a lot of stories. Maybe he says you wouldn't say a Berachas Torah because it's not sort of a core text. It's just Medrash Haggadah. Oh, Chachmas HaKabbalah. What about the wisdom of Kabbalah? Right, Kabbalah. Do you say Berachas Torah on that? He's not sure. In Mechuyev Levarich Berachas Torah, he's not sure if you say a bracha before that. Tihine b'Gemara sham yesh plukta Rav Huna. Rav Huna amar derak lemikra tzarich levarich. Rav Huna degam lemishnah tzarich levarich. So that's right. Our Gemara or the other Gemara says you may only say a bracha on Tanakh. You may also say a bracha on Mishnah. That's the girsa of the Rif. We saw that last time. Upirshu Talmid Rabbeinu Yonah mishum da Mishnah mifareshes tamei mitzvos. Rabbeinu Yonah gives a reason. This is an important reason. Why would you say a bracha on Mishnah, because the whole point of Mishnah is it explains the reasons of the mitzvos. Now, on this account, it's not that Mishnah itself qualifies as a canonical text. Mishnah qualifies for Birchas Torah and for Torah because it's essentially a commentary on Torah itself. It gives the reasons for the mitzvos. So it's an extension of Torah and therefore an extension of Tanakh, and therefore you say Birchas Torah. Rabbi Lazar Amar the Gam L'Gemara Tzarich Levarach L'Shem B'Yat Talmud Mefarish Yikari Psukim. Continuing with Rabbeinu Yonah's approach, the Gemara explains the different psukim, the different verses and their meaning. Again, it's an extension of Mikra. So on this reading of the Gemara, really there's only one sort of canonical text for these purposes, and the other texts are included in Torah, in the expanded universe of Torah, because they comment on Tanakh. That's what qualifies them. The Hamaskana, the conclusion of the Gemara, the Gam LeMedrash, Tzarich Levarach, you also say a bracha on Medrash. Yishum de Medrash, Lo Med Gam Ken Mi'apsukim. Right, then you throw in Medrash, again, on the Rif's Girsa, Medrash is the fourth of the four categories. Why is Medrash included? Because Medrash also involves interpreting the psukim. Since all four of these, one of them, Mikra, is the Bible itself, the other three, Mishnah, Gemara, and Medrash, all explicate the psukim, and that's why they qualify. On this approach of Rabbeinu Yonah, which the Aruch HaShulchan seems to favor here, the main qualification is that you comment on Torah. If you comment on Torah, or you are Tanakh yourself, right? If you comment on the written Torah, then you qualify for these purposes as Torah and for saying a bracha beforehand. Aval divrei Aggadah or Kabbalah, but matters of Aggadah, right, like stories or Kabbalistic wisdom, she'eni karam ledinim v'halachos, that doesn't tie into the legal material of the Torah, which is his understanding, the sort of core of the Torah. Ein tzarich bracha. There's no need for a bracha. It's a nice story. It's a nice explication of the biblical story. You know what? That's not central enough. Torah is the biblical text, and particularly its legal materials, and then the commentaries on that. If you're a nice story, you tell more about Avram breaking the idols. That's very nice. We should definitely teach it to kids. Maybe we should even learn it ourselves. But it doesn't qualify as the sort of the central core of Torah to need Birchas HaTorah. It's an interesting idea. Again, he's not sure about this. He raises this as a question, but it's a provocative suggestion. If, however, we say the reason is not that it needs everything, qualifying as Torah for Birchas HaTorah is based on explicating the legal material of Torah, that's not the qualification. The qualification is being given at Sinai, being part of the overall revelation, whether of the Torah Shebechsav or Torah Shebal Peh. If that's the reason, Mishum Dekulu Torah Mikri, we saw that in the Levush's reason, it's all called Torah. It's all part of the corpus of Torah. If that's your reason, one of those two, then Pshita Shagam Aggadah v'Kabbalah Nitna L'Moshe Misinai. Obviously, both Aggadah, these different stories, and Kabbalah, Kabbalistic wisdom, were obviously given at Sinai, Umikru Torah, and they're called Torah, and then therefore they would be included on that account. According to Rabbeinu Yonah, he says the reason is it needs to comment on the legal core of Torah, and it doesn't do that. So he's not sure. It depends which approach you follow in the Gemara, and there's a debate. And he says Tzarich Ledina, and he's not sure. Yalkut Shimoni would be a subset of Medrash Aggadah, and Zohar would be not really a subset, sort of the classical example of Kabbalah. So that's exactly what he's talking about, right? Yalkut Shimoni and Zohar, would they qualify or not? The Aruch HaShulchan is not sure, and he's not sure even in a practical sense, right? Tzarich Ledina. He doesn't usually do this. The Aruch HaShulchan is supposed to be a practical book. It's supposed to tell you at the end of the day, what do you do? And here, if you went to the Aruch HaShulchan and said, Rabbi, I wake up early in the morning, right after sunrise, and me and my chavrusa, we study Zohar together. Should we say Birchas Torah before that or not? He would say, I'm not sure. Right? That's his view. Or we study the Medrash Rabbah on the Parsha. Should we say Birchas Torah? He's not sure. Tzarich Ian Ledina. A very provocative, interesting view, or it's not even a view, it's a question of the Aruch HaShulchan here. All right, let's keep moving forward. A couple of more comments on the Shulchan Aruch that will attempt to expand our boundaries a little further. The Piskei Tshuvos, which is sort of a collection of different rulings, and that's why we're going to look at the footnotes too, where he goes into a little more detail. He raises a couple of other questions that will be very interesting for us. So Sif Beis Shulchan Aruch, that's what we were just studying. So commenting on that, Tzarich Levarach Bein the Mikra, Bein the Mishnah, Bein the Gemara, Ramah, Bein the Medrash, right? We just read that. And so now he's going to add in a few things. Ba'afilu eno mevin mashalome. That's one point. We're not going to focus on that, but there's a whole question as to whether you say Berachas Torah if you don't understand the words. You're just saying them, right? You're reciting the words, but you don't know what they mean. Does that count as Torah study? You're saying words of Torah on the one hand, on the other hand, you don't understand it. Is learning about saying the words or is about understanding it? Big question. He thinks you say Berachas Torah on that. It's a little controversial. V'chein l'limud hazohar ve'akabbalah chayavim Berachas Torah kodem l'chein. He takes a side. Baruch Shulchan wasn't sure. He says, no, Zohar and Kabbalah, definitely you say a Berachas Torah before studying them. Let's look now at the footnote and see what it says here. And he says it's al pi ta'am halavush dekulu Torah mikri. And we saw this in Lavush, the reasoning in the Lavush, that if it's considered, that the reasoning for what's included is if it's considered Torah or not. That's a determining factor. And Zohar is considered part of Torah. And that's sort of the classical view. And there may be some hyper-rationalists who would say Kabbalah is not part of Torah, but I think the classical, traditional Jewish view is that it would be. I assume that's what the Piskei Teshuvos is channeling here. I think the Aruch HaShulchan said similarly. If you follow the Vush, it's about whether you qualify as being part of Torah. Kabbalah is part of Torah. And he quotes that here too. V'kacham b'Aruch HaShulchan al pi tam Shulchan Aruch HaRav t'kulam nitnu l'Moshe Sinai. Right, maybe a slightly different version because they were given at Sinai. The Aruch HaShulchan sort of said, whether it's A or B, whether it's considered Torah, and that's your standard, or whether the standard is the given to Moshe at Sinai, the Zohar would be included. And the alternative was it's a comment on the core legal center of Torah, and that wouldn't qualify. So that's point number one here. We saw it already in Aruch HaShulchan, but he takes a side in Piskei Teshuvos. V'chein, he says you also say a Berachas Torah prior to Avigam Lilimud Sifrei Musar Drush V'Chasidus. And the same thing, and now we're moving way ahead in time, right? Whereas we're going from more classical texts to books of Musar, right, which could be very contemporary. Someone might write a book of Musar this year. Let's say you learn that. You say Berachas Torah. Or Drush. Someone writes up their drushos. Maybe the drushos are based on wordplay of, words in the Torah that sound like Yiddish, and you give a drusha based on that. I don't know, whatever drushos you're giving. Or Chasidus, right, Hasidic literature from the 18th century and forward. What about that? Does that count as Talmud Torah for our purposes? So he says, yes, you do say Berachas Torah in that. Why? Because usually, if you're reading a drasha, or you're reading Musar, or you're reading Chasidus, usually they'll incorporate some psukim, some lines from Gemara. That counts. That's good enough. As long as this is a new reason. We haven't seen this before. Even if the text itself is not fundamentally any of the things we've said before, if it incorporates some material from those texts, it's part of the expanded universe. It's part of the expanded Torah or expanded Gemara or whatnot, and therefore it qualifies. But he's going to say, but that only gets you so far. That gets you books of Musar, Drush, and Chasidus, but Zulas, except for Uvdos, V'Sipurim Migdoli Yisrael. Right, so I know some people might be upset by this, but he says different stories about great rabbis. They're very nice, they're inspirational, great, but there's no Berachas Torah in them. There's no Torah in them, right? They're not quoting Gemaras usually. They're not quoting Psukim. Af sheyesh ben Musar Haskel, even if they have some valuable hortatory material. It helps you be a better. Helps you practice your Judaism better, maybe. Even so, it's not good enough. If it's not really integrating different psukim and chazals, that's not good enough. Now look at his footnote here. This will be even. We'll take it even a step further. Not just Musar, Drush, and Chasidus, but he quotes the Makor Chaim on this, and then he quotes Shuvos v'Anhagos. He says Dehuadin limud aleph beis im tinok. Let's say you're teaching a kid literally the aleph beis, right? You're saying, aleph beis ba. Or apparently that's how they used to teach. They teach phonetics. I just repeat it a lot of times. Anyway, so what if you're teaching your kid the aleph beis? Mistaber de lo gara milimud ubai berachas Torah. No worse than real study. And you say you have to say berachas Torah before that. Why? The Ramos be aleph beis gufei Torah kimuva bigmara in Shabbos. Wow. So he says they're hinted in the letters is all of Torah. Now this is a Kabbalistic idea, and there's all sorts of works written on this that try to go through the alphabet and point to the different nature of the letters and how they relate to different aspects of Torah. Based on, he's just taking this for granted, this Kabbalistic idea for granted, and saying, you read the Aleph Beis, the Aleph Beis contain all of Torah in them. Therefore, you have to say a Berachas Torah before reading the Aleph Beis. Fine. And and he says, fine. And he says, try to get out of it, if, better not to rely on this if you don't have to. But that seems to be his basic view, that you say a Berachas Torah on literally reading the Aleph Beis. So we've really expanded our category of Torah, our broader Torah universe here, at least according to Piskei Teshuvos, who's pretty lax on this. What does he include? Number one, he takes sides on the question that the Aruch HaShulchan wasn't sure about. He says, yes, Medrash, Aggadah, and Kabbalah, those are all in. They're all part of the broader Torah universe. And even books of Musar and Drush and Chasidus, even though the text itself doesn't qualify as Torah, but it's quoting Psukim, it's quoting Gemaras, that's good enough. Okay, not Gedolim stories, because that's, that doesn't really tie in to any text in the classical Jewish canon. It's stories, even though it's nice, but it's not really Torah. But in the footnote, he throws in that reading the Aleph Beis, teaching your kid the Aleph Beis, the letters contain all of Torah in them in some deep mystical way. And according to the Ramban says this, many people say this, that the whole Torah itself is like God's name. It's like this code. You put all the letters together. It's not that there's semantic meaning. It's that somehow the letters themselves embody God or some deeper ideas. It's a bit outside of beyond my ken. But this idea that the letters themselves have these meanings, and therefore you say Berachas Torah on just teaching letters. Wow, so a nice range of a nice extended range of views here. Again, other people could be a lot more limiting. The Shulchan Aruch himself might not even include Medrash, and the Aruch HaShulchan isn't sure about Medrash, Aggadah at least, and about Kabbalah. But there's a version of this that we saw now in the Piskei Teshuvos that's much broader. Okay, let's jump now to a somewhat related question. We'll see how it ties in about qualitative levels of Talmud Torah. If our question is what's the scope of Torah, so we've cast our net in fairly widely, and we said what's included, what's not in terms of Berachas Torah, which may correlate to being defined as Torah. But maybe it's not just a yes or no question, a binary question, are you included or not? But to what extent and in what ways do you count? In what ways are you included? So that's what we're going to look at now with these next few sources. So the Nefesh HaChaim, Rav Chaim of Volozhin, an important, let's say, misnagid Kabbalist, wrote a whole sefer. Nefesh HaChaim is sort of a mix of a Musar and Hashkafa and all sorts of interesting things. Shar Dalid, the fourth section of 4, is all about the importance of Torah study. And part of what he's doing is polemicizing against Hasidus, because one of the goals of Hasidus, it said, look, Judaism is too intellectual. If you want to succeed, you have to study a lot of Talmud. It's hard to study Talmud. Not everyone can study Talmud. We want to be more accessible to everyone. And we're going to promote other modes of Torah study or Torah piety, one of which is reading Tehillim. Right? Reading Tehillim is largely promoted as a Hasidic practice. And they tried not just, that they tried to get for everyone. Right nowadays, in some communities, Tehillim is more of a women's thing. That was certainly not the case when it was promoted by Hasidus as an approach for everyone, even people who didn't have an education, men or women, to approach God. So the Nefesh HaChaim is responding to this, and he says, "Inyan Esek HaTorah Lishma." That's one of his focal points in the work. Is it's important to study Torah and to study it Lishma for its own sake, and also for the sake of connecting to God and affecting the outer worlds in some Kabbalistic way. So here's what he says. Ha'emes habar. Here's the truth. Here's the hard, cold truth. Ki lishma ein perusho dveikus kol shesovrim ata rov ha'olam. So some people think that and when he says some people, he means Hasidim, think that lishma means connecting to God. And apparently some even had the interpretation, lishma should be understood as l'shem, l'shem Hashem, for the sake of God. That you study Torah for the sake of God. The goal of studying Torah is to cleave to God. That's what a lot of people think, but they're wrong. Sharei Amru Chazal, b'Medrash, Shebikesh David HaMelech Al Vashalom Milufanav Yisparach. David HaMelech, King David, asks God he says, please, sha'osik b'Tehillim yichashiv etzlo yisparach ki'ilu ha'osek b'negoim va'alos. Right, David, who authored Tehillim, or at least most of Tehillim, according to the Gemara. So David tells Hashem, he asks Hashem, please make it count when people study Tehillim to be just as good as if they studied Negoim and Ahalos. Right? These are laws of purity, complicated Talmudic laws of purity. So, he's asking that Tehillim should be just as good. So the question itself betrays the fact that it's not. Right? Haresha Asek Milchos Hashas Be'ir V'Yagiahu Inyan Yoser Nala Ve'ahu L'Fanav Yisparach Me'amiras Tehillim. Obviously, David HaMelech needed to ask this because it was clear before he asked this that studying complicated things and really working on it, having to delve into the text, understand it, that's obviously preferable to God than Tehillim, which you can, you sort of daven it up. You just read the words, you move through it. Obviously, the preferable thing would be the more intensive study. David HaMelech asks, please make it count, even though it's not as intensive. I didn't include this, but the continuation is it's not clear that God said yes. God very well may have said no. Tehillim isn't as good as learning Negoim and Alos. Negoim and Alos is more important. It should be about serious investment, of serious intellectual investment. It shouldn't be just reciting a bunch of words. And so then he says, Nomar shalishma perish dveikos davka. If lishma just means doing something with intent to cleave to God, to connect to God, and that's the whole point of Torah study. Tehillim is great. You're reading these things, you're praising God, you're asking God things. That's super dveikus. That's super connecting to God. But guess what? That's not what Talmud Torah is about. Talmud Torah is not about connecting to God primarily. You remember 2 weeks ago we saw Rav Lichtenstein, where at least part of the goal of studying Torah is connecting to God in that way, la'avdo, serving God. Here he says dveikus is not the main goal of Torah study. The main goal of Torah study is to study Torah for its own sake, and that means the more serious the text you're studying, the more intensive the learning is, the better you're learning, period. It's that simple. So we have a qualitative range of different types of Talmud Torah: intensive, serious Talmud Torah, and sort of fluffier, less intensive, less significant realms of Talmud Torah. This idea gets picked up very extensively. Nefesh Chaim is very influential sefer, especially in Lithuanian yeshiva circles. So if you look at basically any Litvish Musar sefer or approach in the last 200 years, basically all of them quote this idea, and it's known, the concept here is known as Bittul Torah Be'echus, or Be'echut. Right, so Bittul Torah is the idea of sort of wasting Torah, or wasting time for Torah study. And, generally that's, one shouldn't do that. You should be studying Torah at all times instead of wasting time. And this idea is Bittul Torah Be'echus. If you could be studying Gemara Be'iyun, intensively studying Gemara, and instead you're reading Tehillim, a lot easier, that is qualitative Bittul Torah. You're qualitatively wasting Torah, because even though you're studying every minute, you're doing it at a lower level. Now, I think that's not absolute. Obviously, you have to find some time to master the whole corpus of Torah, according to the classical Lithuanian yeshiva approach. So you have to spend some time on Tanakh and somewhere along the way, some time along the way on easier material, Aggadah. Kabbalah, I think, is not understood to be easy. Kabbalah is a complicated endeavor. So I don't know if, that, again, it's not different in terms of the form of Talmud Torah. But the point is, your primary focus should be on the core aspects of Torah, and there's this setting of levels of how serious the learning is. Here's one of the proofs that people like to bring to this idea about qualitative levels of Torah. This is based on a Gemara. The Shulchan Aruch cites this. Mivatlan Talmud Torah l'shmor mikra Megillah. The Gemara says that it's appropriate to waste Torah learning time. You're supposed to do Bittul Torah, waste your Torah learning time to go and hear the Megillah. Now, the obvious question is, wait a second, Megillah is a book of Tanakh. So you're reading the Megillah, that's Talmud Torah. What do you mean you're wasting Talmud Torah time to read the Megillah? Now, there's many answers. It might be that you don't understand what the words in the Megillah mean. It might be that you have to go to shul. You have to go from where you're learning to shul, and the walking time is a waste of time. But one of the answers is here in the Shar Ephraim. So it's in the base of Ephraim, rather. He says, V'nireh Da'afil b'limud nevim uksuvim b'drashos hamikros havi bittul legabe limud mishnah gemara. If you're reading Nach and you're looking at the interpretations of the psukim, you're trying to understand what the psukim are saying. That's all very nice. You're learning Torah at some level, but it's bittul Torah. It's wasting Torah learning time relative to legabe limud mishnah gemara. Definitely, if you're just reading the Megillah, right? In shul, everyone just reads the Megillah. You're not like analyzing the Megillah most of the time. You're just reading it. Definitely, that is less valuable learning than Gemara. Umishnah mifareshes b'pera kol kisvei she'en kor miksuvim b'Shabbos v'pnei bittul beis hamedrash. The Mishnah says explicitly, you're not supposed to learn ksuvim on Shabbos because it's a waste of beis medrash time. And the way Rashi explains it there, he quotes the Rashi. Tell them Shlomo, right? Shabbos afternoon, the rabbi would give a drasha, not a drasha, would give a halacha shir, and it's important to learn halacha. That's much more important than studying Tanakh. Says this Mishnah, at least as it's interpreted by Rashi. And the Beis Ephraim says this is a broader idea. It's not like a weird thing about what their Shabbos schedule was about. It teaches us this broader principle of bittul Torah be'echos, that there's an idea of qualitative waste of Torah study time to study less intensive things instead of more intensive things. I'll just note, even though this really caught on in the Lithuanian yeshiva world from the Nefesh Chaim and forward, it's a bit more controversial, especially in circles that value Tanakh study or just in general value people studying in areas that they are attracted to, as opposed to sort of one approach. You study Gemara, and you study Halacha, and that's the main approach, and everything else is tangential. Just note that. But this is an important approach, the whole school of an approach to learning Torah, that there's this qualitative differentiation. We'll just see the Bia Omer. Rav Ovadia Yosef quotes this idea as well in an interesting context. He says, some of the sages of the generation, skula ligmar kol hashas besoch tkufa ktsara b'li havana klal. So there's this idea that people have. You get everyone together, either individually or a group, and you say, okay, let's finish Shas together. Let's all learn Shas together really quickly. You get you get 300 people in a room, and you say everyone does everyone does 10 dapim, and you just read through 10 dapim of Gemara in an hour. And we'll finish Shas as a room, and that'll be great. We'll make a Sima Shas together. And he's like, that is a terrible idea. But who ibud zman? It's a waste of time. It doesn't count as learning. This is the greatest waste of Torah learning possible. Again, this is where you're not trying to understand it at all, right? Again, it's a little bit of an extreme case. And he quotes a source in the Eitz Chaim like this. This is actually originally a source about davening, I believe, but he's applying it here. Better a little bit with focus than a lot without focus, because you don't retain it, you don't understand it. The idea of taking someone who otherwise would be learning seriously and say, okay, let's do an event, let's do a finish the Shas in the room event instead of your usual Torah learning schedule. This is an Isser Gamor. This is absolutely prohibited. Interesting idea, and again, this is a function of the bittul Torah be'echos. Although here it's not about which corpus you're studying, right? It's not about Tanakh versus Gemara or something like that. Here it's about the nature of your study, right? Either way, it's Gemara, but it's Gemara where you're actually understanding it, and Gemara where you're not. I'm not sure this is anti-Daf Yomi. I think this could be pro-Daf Yomi if you understand what you're doing in Daf Yomi, right? I mean, I think everyone would agree. If Daf Yomi just means reading the words and not having any clue what you're saying, it's not like there's no mitzvah to say the words. They're not magic words. So I think of at least one version of this, everyone would agree to. The question is somewhere in the middle. You understand some of it, you cover more ground, you feel like you accomplish more. Is that better, or is it better to do a lot less and actually understand what you're doing? Anyway, that's the series of views on bittul Torah be'echos, qualitative waste of Torah study time. And now we'll take up maybe the most controversial suggestion. We'll do this quickly. But what about secular studies? Is there any way to think about secular studies as qualifying as Torah in some sense, and maybe even for saying a bracha on Torah study? So as I said, this is controversial. We'll see how things go. The place to look, there's a whole debate about this about 30 years ago, and it's based on the book by Rabbi Norman Lamb Azal. He passed away about 2 years ago. His book Torah Madda. right, about the encounter of religious learning and worldly knowledge. And he has several different models, several different approaches in Jewish tradition as to why you might think there's value to secular studies. One of them is the Rambam. The Rambam sees Madda, sees secular studies as not just permitted, but actually obligatory. Understanding God and how God created the world in a philosophical sense and in a scientific sense, these help us understand who God is. And there's a mitzvah to know God and to love God and all of these things. And that helps you get there. And without studying science and philosophy, you won't possibly be able to appreciate God. And that's why we're given these the metaphysics and these sorts of things. So I'll just read this quote from the Rambam in this book. In the introduction to the guide, he says, the Almighty, meaning God, desiring to lead us to perfection and improve the state of our society, revealed to us his laws to regulate our actions. The laws presuppose an advanced state of intellectual culture. You can only really appreciate the laws in the Torah if you previously know philosophy. We must first have a knowledge of metaphysics, but this discipline can only be approached after the study of physics, right? That's the book after physics. So you need to know physics, you need to know metaphysics, then you can actually study Torah. That's why the Torah starts with Bereshis, with creation, with physical science, because you need to understand science before you can understand metaphysics, before you can understand Torah. And you love God through studying Torah. We're not going to be able to go through this. Everyone's highly recommended that you read this book, Torah Madda. It's a wonderful, wonderful book, both the historical survey and the approach, whichever approach makes sense or not. Whether you agree with the conclusion or not, it's a really important anthology of sources at the very least. And he says, basically, the conclusion here of the argumentation is, Maimonides holds that proper study of worldly wisdom is halachically the fulfillment of the commandment to study Torah. Because, right, one's supposed to split your time into three. We actually read this 2 weeks ago. 1/3 written law, 1/3 oral law, 1/3 Gemara. What's counted in Gemara? He includes Pardes. Pardes includes what's in the Rambam himself is the book of Madda, the book of science or wisdom, and includes a lot of philosophy. If you look, the first book in the beginning of the Rambam, Mishnah Torah, he includes a lot of science and philosophy. And so we see that's right in the Rambam in his Mishnah Torah says, read my Mishnah Torah. That's just like sort of the core of the oral Torah. And part of that is philosophy and science. So the Rambam thinks that part of worldly wisdom is Torah. Part of Torah is part of worldly wisdom. That's the Rambam's view. And now Rabbi Lamb takes this a step further later in the book when he sort of talks about the implications of some of his views. First, he quotes Rav Chaim Volozhin. We just saw Rav Chaim Volozhin. Rabbi Lamb wrote his dissertation and then later a book on Rav Chaim Volozhin. And he says there's a hierarchy of texts and their value within Talmud Torah. We just saw that, right? And Medrash Tehillim, he quotes, learning Psalms should be considered like learning Negaim and Ahalos, like regular halachic study. I'd say not just regular halachic study, but advanced halachic study, because they're complicated tractates. And there's no indication the plea was granted, so it's a negative. The highest value is the study of halacha. And that's what he says there. And every Torah in the scroll has some kedusha, has some holiness, but learning Torah at the greatest level is the highest reward. Studying Aggadah, studying stories, is a lower level, not the same level as halacha. What about Musar? That may be also, maybe if it's maybe useful, but it's not quite Talmud Torah. That's Reb Chaim Volozhin, which we saw a piece of. And then Rabbi Lamb takes this a step further. He says, he tries to combine this with the Rambam. He says the Rambam, as we saw in chapter 4, that's what we just read, holds that Madda has Talmud Torah value. Now, Reb Chaim Volozhin does not think so, right? He's not a Maimonidean in this way, but we might put the two together. We might say that just as Reb Chaim Volozhin envisions a hierarchy of texts of Talmud Torah, there's a category of Talmud Torah that is textless, a form of Torah study that calls for intellection, but has no formal canonized text upon which such thinking is focused. Madda is this textless subject of Talmud Torah, meaning Madda, secular wisdom that's valuable, let's say philosophy, metaphysics, physics, that's part of Torah. There's just no text. Usually you can say, okay, Mikra, Mishnah, Gemara, Medrash, those are texts of Torah. But there's some things there's no text, but it's still part of Torah, as the Rambam says. It's maybe has a different nature in some way. So he says, okay, let's go with that. Now, if Madda is to be accepted as included as Talmud Torah, we have some immediate questions. Should one recite a Birchas Torah upon studying organic chemistry? I think Rabbi Lamb himself was a chemist as an undergrad. Or equally absurd, can you study calculus all day and be halachically exempt from other Talmud Torah because you're learning? Now he says clearly no. The answer is no, because the bracha on Talmud Torah is only texts of Torah. So textless Torah might be excluded. But what he's doing there, he's leaving open the possibility, right? Remember when we were learning the Gemara, we said, is this Gemara saying what you say about Torah on? Is this telling you what counts as Torah and what doesn't? That's one possibility. The other possibility is there could be things that count as Torah, but for some other reason, you don't say Berachas Torah. For example, there's no action of Torah study. It's in your mind, so there's no action or something like that. So this might be another reason, right? There's no text of Madda, so you don't say Berachas Torah, but that's sort of a side reason. It still is Torah. It's just you don't say a bracha. That's what he leaves open. He leaves open that possibility. So the study of physics will be an act of Torah study, but requires no blessing. Fascinating. This is a suggestion of Rabbi Lamb. Again, this is not his own view per se. He puts forward several different models, suggests maybe these are the implications of this view, but he puts it out there, which is pretty bold, and he got some pushback for it. So in 1992, just over 30 years ago, Yonasan Rosenblum, who's I guess a Haredi columnist, was then, still is now, he critiqued the Torah Madda book in its original edition, and a few different angles of the critique. But one thing he says, right, he's objecting to the idea that secular study is important, or is very important from a Jewish perspective, beyond this sort of instrumental value of secular wisdom to help you get a job, to help you make money, to make a living, that sort of thing. He doesn't see much value beyond that. And he says, so great is the value of Madda for Dr. Lamb, that the distinction between it and Torah finally blurs altogether, right? You fulfill Torah study by studying sciences and humanities. This conclusion leads him to entertain seriously such questions as, should one recite Berachas Torah on entering the chemistry lab? May one study calculus all day and thereby fulfill his obligation of Talmud Torah? We just read that. And he obviously rejects that idea and pushes back on it. Now, Mayor Schiller says, well, he never really took seriously the idea of saying Berachas Torah. That's a distortion. He calls it an absurd idea. But I guess the point, how you litigate those details is sort of less important. The main point is, I think, right, and our analysis really points to this. Even if he never thought about saying Berachas Torah seriously, the point is he does take seriously on this view the idea that studying Madda could be Torah, could be qualified as Torah study, even though you don't say a bracha. It's sort of for a technical reason. There's no text, so you don't say a bracha. You only say a bracha on Torah texts. Torah non-text or textless Torah, you don't say a bracha, but it still is fully Talmud Torah. That's at least one of the possibilities that Rabbi Lamb raises. This whole question about Berachas Torah is almost like a lightning rod, because how could you say a bracha? How could you ritualize it? But I don't think it's any less radical, the idea that studying secular wisdom, that's part of Torah in some broader sense, as the Rambam says, that would count as Torah. So I think we've seen an interesting progression here, again, and it's interesting. Some of the progression codes, an expansive view of what counts as Torah can code either as, I don't know, right wing or left wing. I don't know if those terms even mean anything, but we saw those who expand Talmud Torah beyond the Gemara's four categories of Mikra, Mishnah, Gemara, and Medrash, and extended even to Medrash, Aggadah, and even to Kabbalah, and maybe even to Aleph Beis, and maybe even to Musar and Hasidus on the one hand, and then on the other hand, Rabbi Lamb extends it to secular knowledge. Again, I think if you asked, I don't know, if you, one seems to, they seem to pull in different directions, whatever you want to do with that. But in terms of reading the Sugya, they're moving in a similar direction, right? This idea that, okay, it's not part of a canonical text per se, but it maybe has some connection back. And Rabbi Lamb doesn't suggest that you actually say Berachas Torah, but he does suggest that maybe this would qualify as Torah, albeit textless Torah. So I hope over these 3 weeks we've explored the boundaries of what counts as Torah, what doesn't, some of the reasons why one would study Torah, some of the outer bounds through this sugya in brachos. I'm happy to entertain questions or otherwise to close out this important topic in advance of Shavuot, just a few weeks from now. And we should all be lucky to study as much Torah in all of its different definitions.
Yeah, thank you so much. I also just want to give a quick plug to the Lair House, which recently had a symposium on Torah Madda. Throughout this, I was, thinking about some of those things, especially when we came up to the source about, having like Musar, Dreshus Chasidus like included within Torah. And then getting to the end with Rabbi Lamb, I was thinking a lot about, in particular, Eli Natan Kupferberg's piece, seeing Madda, like secular studies, as, something that informs and kind of can lead to Chiddushei Torah. So yeah, I guess, I don't know, I'm thinking about that as kind of like this midpoint of like potential Torah. And maybe since it has the potential but isn't quite there, could be, I guess, a reason for not making a bracha on it, because it could fall out either way. But
yeah, no, I like that a lot. Actually, I was also, as I was preparing this year, I also was thinking that Rabbi Lamb's view of textless Torah integrates nicely with Eli Natan's piece. So
yeah,
I think we think similarly on this, and for good reason. Yeah, the idea that, I mean, the Rambam essentially took philosophy. If you asked people before the Rambam, they would say this is not Torah. Obviously, this is philosophy. The Rambam somehow folds it in, and it's a way of sneaking, of making, making philosophy into Torah, or as you're saying, maybe potential Torah, as Ray Lamb says, textless Torah. But maybe it's not textless anymore because the Rambam puts it in Mishnah Torah. So if you say Mishnah Torah somehow becomes a text, then there's the philosophy in there at least becomes part of it, and you can go further. There are some later books that that like are written in rabbinic terms, quote Gemaras, and basically teach the laws of physics. And the Gra wrote a book that on geometry in Hebrew, right? So Ayel Meshulash. So does that become Torah? And then can you learn geometry? And that's Talmud Torah in some sense. It's a radical idea, and Ray Lamb raises it and gets some flack for it. And it fits with Eli Natan's piece as well. So yeah, thank you for that note.
Yeah, I guess that's it for me. Again, on behalf of everyone who has been to any of the shiurim in this series, thank you so much. It's been really, it's been a pleasure. And of course, looking forward to learning with you again soon. I won't be there in the mornings for the this upcoming series leading up to Shavuot, but I'm sure it'll be wonderful. And yeah, thank you so much.